In a tightly knit suburban enclave, where manicured lawns and picket fences served as a source of pride, one woman stood as the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood integrity. Karen Thompson, a middle-aged mother with an arsenal of rules, effectively embodied the quintessential HOA enforcer. Her perfectly curled hair and constant presence in the afternoon sun did little to disguise her watchful gaze that seemed to probe any deviation from her idealized vision of order. Karen was no ordinary resident. She possessed an unsettling blend of authority and entitlement, convinced that every action taken by her neighbors required her approval. Her absolute disdain for any perceived disruptions colored her interactions with everyone around her. If a child rode their bike too fast down the street or a neighbor's decoration ventured beyond the mainstays of tasteful holiday cheer, Karen would be there, clipboard in hand, armed with the latest list of HOA ordinance violations, ready to lecture as if she were conducting an inspection at a military facility. What motivated her incessant rule enforcement, many speculated, was a deep-rooted need for control in her own life. Perhaps it stemmed from an unfulfilled ambition or the absence of authority elsewhere. Whatever the cause, it fueled her relentless pursuit of order in the neighborhood. No one understood this more than Richard, the man who lived a few doors down. He often lamented to his wife how much time Karen invested into complaining to the HOA board about minor infractions as though she had appointed herself its president. Deciding one day that snowplows cluttered the serenity of winter wonderlands, Karen took matters into her own hands and issued a sweeping restriction against them, insisting they were unnecessary intrusions into the tranquil landscape. Neighbors exchanged eye rolls and shared smirks over steaming mugs of cocoa as they watched her enforce this ridiculous mandate, fully aware that they might one day need just that convenience. Little did Karen know, her determination to regulate every aspect of living would soon be put to the test, with irony layered thicker than the snow soon to blanket their homes. In her quest for control, she unwittingly set the stage for her own downfall, a lesson in humility she would not forget anytime soon. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point one chilly afternoon when Karen convened an impromptu HOA meeting at her home. With a clipboard clasped tightly under her arm, she stood before a gathering of disgruntled residents, ready to unveil her latest ruling against local snowplow services. Her voice echoed with authority as she declared that the roar of snowplows was not only unnecessary but also a blatant violation of the community's cherished peace and quiet. Snowplows disrupt our tranquil winter landscape, she insisted, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of dissent. We must uphold the standards that make this neighborhood beautiful. I propose we ban all snowplow operations effective immediately. A few neighbors exchanged glances, sharing silent exasperation at yet another decree from their self-appointed overseer. Karen's conviction wavered little despite murmurs of discontent. Richard, the neighbor who had previously faced her ire over trivial matters, raised his hand hesitantly. But Karen, what if there's a heavy snowstorm? Some of us rely on those services to keep our driveways clear for emergencies. His concern was met with an icy stare. Nonsense. We can manage just fine with shovels in our own two hands, she retorted, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. Let's enforce this rule for the good of all. The palpable unease in the room hung thick as several residents reluctantly nodded in agreement while others rolled their eyes in frustration. As Karen basked in self-satisfaction over what she believed was a decisive victory for neighborhood standards, whispers spread among those affected by her decree. They knew all too well how much they would miss the convenience of snowplows during winter storms. However, voicing their grievances felt futile under Karen's watchful eye. Uneasily, they returned to their homes, some reluctantly starting to put away their snowplow contracts and others contemplating how they would navigate the coming winter months without the timely service. Unbeknownst to them, Karen's authoritarian enforcement was about to be put to the ultimate test, one that would lead her down a path lined with irony and serve as a reminder that control does not always come without consequences. As the news of Karen's snowplow ban spread through the neighborhood, reactions were as varied as the residents themselves. In the days that followed the meeting, some neighbors nodded in agreement with her decision, convinced that preserving the neighborhood's aesthetic was paramount. They believed that Karen's stringent enforcement of rules helped maintain property values and created a sense of community pride. For them, her actions represented a necessary stand against what they viewed as chaos creeping into their orderly lives. However, for many others, Karen's decree felt like an overreach of power. Richard, who had voiced his concerns at the HOA meeting, found himself increasingly frustrated. He had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that heavy snowfall could turn serene streets into treacherous paths overnight. Conversations over backyard fences or during quick encounters at the mailbox often revolved around how impractical Karen's ruling was. "What about when it snows 3 feet?" one neighbor lamented to another while shoveling their walkway. "I can't shovel all that by myself." Among this dissenting group was Lisa, a single mother who relied on a snowplow service not just for convenience but for safety. With 2 young children at home, she worried about getting stuck during severe weather and having no way to get to work or help her kids if emergencies arose. Her frustration boiled over one evening as she vented to her friend over coffee. "I just can't believe she thinks we can handle everything with a shovel. It's ridiculous," Lisa exclaimed. Yet there were those who found amusement in the situation unfolding around them. They chuckled at how fervently Karen clung to her rules while others secretly hoped for a hefty snowfall to prove her wrong. A clandestine group formed among these residents, bonding over their shared frustrations and plotting light-hearted pranks against Karen's strict governance. As winter continued its march toward its peak, whispers of dissent grew louder within the community, fueling an undercurrent of camaraderie among those who felt stifled by Karen's relentless control. The more she insisted on enforcing her vision of order, the more divided opinions became. Some cherished the peace she sought to uphold while others braced for what they knew would soon follow, an inevitable blizzard that would test both community spirit and Karen's authority in ways she couldn't foresee. As winter settled in, the weather took a dramatic turn one fateful evening. Dark clouds rolled in ominously, and the air thickened with a chill that hinted at impending chaos. By nightfall, the first flakes began to drift down like feathers, and soon the gentle snowfall morphed into a relentless blizzard. Winds howled through the neighborhood like a freight train, driving snow horizontally and obliterating visibility. Residents awakened to find their world transformed into a swirling white abyss. The streets were quickly buried under feet of snow, driveways became impassable mountains, and vehicles were hidden beneath thick blankets of white. Families huddled inside their homes, trying to keep warm as the temperature plunged and the storm raged on. Richard peered out of his window, frustration etched across his face as he watched the chaos unfold. He had warned Karen about this very scenario, but now it felt bittersweet to see his concerns validated. He turned to Lisa, who had also ventured out, each of them bundled in layers of winter gear. "This is insane," Richard exclaimed, shaking his head. "We can't even see where the road is." Meanwhile, Karen scrolled through her social media feed, hoping for news that might alleviate her growing anxiety. As the reality of the blizzard sunk in, she began to feel a gnawing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. She had dismissed pleas about snowplows just days earlier and now found herself questioning her decision. Her driveway was already filling with snow, and with every passing hour, the sight of her car becoming more entombed grew more troubling. As neighbors attempted to clear their sidewalks with shovels, it became evident how futile their efforts were against nature's fury. Conversations turned from casual chatter to urgent discussions about how they would manage without access to professional snow removal services. "We can't even get out for groceries at this rate," one neighbor shouted over the wind. The blizzard raged on, transforming the once peaceful neighborhood into a scene of chaos and urgency. Those who had supported Karen's decree now felt its weight pressing down on them as frustration bubbled to the surface. It wasn't long before the irony of Karen's insistence on order began to dawn on her. She needed help. In that moment of realization, she could only hope that others would come to her aid when she had denied them a lifeline just days earlier. The storm had set in motion events that would reshape not only her authority but also the fragile dynamics of their community. As the storm raged on, Karen found herself pacing anxiously in her living room, glancing repeatedly out the window at the accumulating snow. With each passing hour, her anxiety grew more palpable. What had once seemed like a quaint winter wonderland now felt like a prison, its beauty overshadowed by an oppressive blanket of white isolation. When she finally mustered the courage to step outside, she was met with a chilling reality. Her driveway was completely unrecognizable beneath thick drifts of snow. The weight of the storm pressed heavily against her chest as she squinted at her car, buried to its windows in snow. Panic surged through her as she realized she had no way of getting it unstuck, or leaving her home for that matter. Karen's mind raced back to her dismissive remarks about snowplows just days earlier. "Those machines are loud and unnecessary," echoes of her own words haunted her as she stood helplessly. Now, faced with the consequences of her previous arrogance, she cursed her stubbornness. The very service she had deemed an intruder was precisely what she needed at this moment. Desperation set in as she grabbed her cell phone and scrolled through her contacts, hoping one of her neighbors could help. The thought of calling anyone she had previously scorned churned her stomach. After all, who would want to lend a hand to someone who had denied them much-needed assistance? She hesitated, but time was slipping away, and every moment spent shoveling the heavy snow felt increasingly futile. Back inside, her thoughts spiraled into guilt and frustration. She had prided herself on being a pillar of order and decorum in the neighborhood, but now that image crumbled under the weight of reality. If only she could turn back time and see beyond her rigid beliefs, if only she hadn't been so quick to dismiss the needs of others for the sake of enforcing rules. As she peered out the window again, watching fellow neighbors struggle against the elements with shovels in hand, she felt a mixture of dread and urgency. They were all battling their own predicaments, yet it began to dawn on her that their shared struggle could forge a chance for redemption, if only she could find the humility to ask for help instead of maintaining her facade of control. In that moment, Karen understood that true strength lay not in strict enforcement but in community support, and perhaps it was time to reach out before it was too late. With a heavy heart and a sense of urgency, Karen picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. The names of her neighbors appeared before her, each one a reminder of her past transgressions, and she hesitated, dreading the thought of reaching out for help. She needed someone to plow her driveway, yet the very people she had scorned and dismissed were the ones she now depended on. Taking a deep breath, she dialed Richard's number, her mind racing with anxieties about how he would react. After what felt like an eternity, he answered. "Hello?" His voice was cautious, almost guarded. "Richard, it's Karen," she began, forcing a semblance of calm into her voice. "I'm in a bit of a situation. My driveway is completely buried under snow, and I can't get my car out. Could you possibly come over to help?" As she spoke, she could hear the faint sound of laughter and chatter in the background, evidence of neighbors coming together to cope with the storm without her. There was a long pause before Richard replied. Karen, I'm really sorry to hear that. But I think everyone is pretty much doing their own thing right now." The tone was polite but firm, and Karen could sense his reluctance to extend help to someone who had previously marginalized their needs. Feeling dejected yet determined, she tried another neighbor, Lisa. The phone rang several times before Lisa answered, her voice wary right from the start. "What do you want, Karen?" "Lisa, please," Karen began imploringly. "I really need your help. With the snow and everything." "Oh, I wish I could," Lisa interrupted, the strain of frustration clear in her voice. "But we're managing over here too. And honestly, it's difficult to forget everything you said at the meeting about snowplows." After several failed attempts with other neighbors who shared similar sentiments of hesitance or outright refusal to assist her, Karen felt a growing chasm of isolation. Friends had turned into foes in her quest for order and control. Pacing the interior of her home, she realized this was no ordinary winter storm, it was a reckoning, a stark reminder that community isn't just about enforcing rules but fostering relationships based on mutual support and respect. There was no escaping the reality that her previous attitude had left her alienated in an hour of need. With panic starting to claw at her insides again, Karen wrestled with an overwhelming sense of regret for dismissing those around her. As she gazed out at the swirling storm, she came to understand that recognition and change must begin within. If there was any hope for redemption, it would require humility in asking for forgiveness and assistance from those she once governed so rigidly. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the neighborhood in a thick layer of white, one neighbor stood at his window, observing the chaos outside. David had always been a quiet man, preferring to keep to himself and avoid confrontation. He had watched Karen's reign as the HOA enforcer unfold from a distance, often shaking his head at her rigid rules and the way she treated others. Yet, despite his grievances, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of compassion for her plight as he saw her pacing anxiously in her home. David recalled how Karen had dismissed his concerns about snowplows during the meeting, scoffing at his suggestion that they could be beneficial during heavy storms. But as he watched her struggle now, he felt a familiar tug of empathy. After all, no one deserved to feel trapped and isolated in their own home, especially not during such a harsh winter storm. With a resolve he didn't fully understand, David grabbed his coat and hat and stepped outside into the swirling snow. The biting wind stung his face as he made his way toward Karen's house. He was acutely aware of the risks involved in helping someone who had once been so dismissive of the community's needs. Yet something inside him pushed him forward. Perhaps it was the belief that compassion could bridge even the widest gaps created by past actions. When he arrived at Karen's door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. The sound was muffled by the thick snow, but soon enough Karen opened the door, eyes wide with surprise and relief. "David," she stammered, disbelief etched on her face. "I saw you needed help," he said simply, brushing off any lingering resentment. "I can help clear your driveway if you'd like." Tears brimmed in Karen's eyes as she stepped aside to let him in. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly under the weight of emotion. It was a small act of kindness that spoke volumes. It symbolized not only forgiveness but also a chance for redemption. Together they trudged through the snow to tackle the task ahead. As they worked side by side, neither spoke much. There was an unspoken understanding between them that transcended words. With each shovelful of snow they cleared, Karen began to reflect on her past behavior and how important it was to foster relationships within their community rather than enforce rigid rules without compassion. In that moment of shared labor amidst adversity, David's decision to help despite their history became a powerful testament to community spirit. It illustrated that even when faced with past grievances, compassion could pave the way for healing and understanding, one shovel at a time. As the blizzard continued to wreak havoc, the residents of the neighborhood had begun to feel the weight of their predicament. Snowdrifts piled higher with each passing hour, and despite their efforts, the situation seemed increasingly dire. Just when hope felt as if it were slipping away, a low rumble echoed through the storm, a sound that sent a wave of anticipation rippling through the community. Emerging from the swirling white chaos, a bright yellow snowplow appeared, its headlights piercing through the gloom. As it chugged steadily down the street, a collective gasp of relief rose from the gathered neighbors, many of whom had been shoveling tirelessly without success. The sight of the plow was transformative. It became not just a vehicle for clearing snow but a symbol of redemption and unity for both Karen and her community. Karen stood alongside David, her heart pounding as she watched the snowplow approach. Memories of her earlier decree flooded back to her, and she felt a twinge of shame mixed with gratitude. Here was the very service she had deemed unnecessary, now arriving like a knight in shining armor when all seemed lost. It was a humbling moment that underscored the irony of her previous stance. As the plow began its work, clearing away the heavy layers of snow from the roads, cheers erupted from the crowd. Neighbors exchanged elated glances and smiles that had been absent during their struggles. The atmosphere shifted from one of despair to one of camaraderie. They were no longer isolated individuals battling against nature but a community coming together to face adversity head-on. Watching from the sidelines, Karen felt a newfound sense of belonging as she joined in the applause for the driver, who waved at them with a grin. In that moment, she realized that true leadership was not about enforcing rules but about supporting one another during challenging times. As she caught David's eye, he gave her an encouraging nod, and she knew they had crossed a bridge toward healing. When the plow finally cleared her driveway, Karen felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude both for the machine that had arrived like a savior and for her neighbors' willingness to help despite their past grievances. She understood now that her actions could have far-reaching impacts beyond herself and that fostering relationships built on compassion was crucial in any community. As snow melted away under the powerful blade of the plow, Karen made a silent promise to herself: she would work to rebuild trust among her neighbors and ensure that their voices were heard moving forward. The blizzard may have tested them all, but it also laid the groundwork for a stronger community rooted in understanding and mutual support. As the snow continued to melt and the streets slowly became navigable again, Karen found herself reflecting deeply on the series of events that had unfolded during the blizzard. Standing outside her home, she watched her neighbors working together to clear away the remnants of winter's fury, laughter and camaraderie filling the air as they shared stories and hot drinks. The sense of community warmth contrasted sharply with her earlier isolation, where she had felt trapped in her own rigid rules. Karen had always prided herself on maintaining order, believing she was acting in the neighborhood's best interest. However, witnessing how David's simple act of kindness had brought people together made her reconsider her previous stance. She remembered moments when she had dismissed their needs in favor of enforcing her vision of an ideal community, failing to recognize that flexibility and cooperation could lead to even greater harmony. Stepping forward, she approached a small group of neighbors who were chatting cheerfully as they cleared snow from their sidewalks. Their conversations were filled with light-hearted banter and mutual support, a stark contrast to the tension that had once filled their interactions over HOA meetings. Karen felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with regret as she recalled the times she had wielded her authority like a weapon instead of fostering understanding. "Hey everyone," she called out tentatively, drawing their attention. A few heads turned, surprised by her approach. "I just wanted to say thank you for helping each other out during the storm. I realize now how vital it is to lend a hand when we need it. I haven't always been supportive or considerate of everyone's needs." The murmurs quieted as Karen continued. "I've learned that being part of this community means more than just following rules, it's about being there for one another in times of trouble. I'd like to do better moving forward and make sure that everyone feels heard and valued." Her admission hung in the air, met with nods of understanding from her neighbors. Slowly but surely, walls built through misunderstandings began to crumble as they processed her words. A neighbor stepped forward with a warm smile. "We all have our moments, Karen. It's never too late to grow from them." Encouraged by their response, Karen felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer just an enforcer but a member of a community that thrived on cooperation and compassion. Embracing this new perspective would not happen overnight, but she was committed to rebuilding trust, a trust that would require vulnerability and openness. As the sun peeked through the clouds, casting warm rays over the freshly cleared streets, Karen felt hope bloom within her, a sense that they could move forward together stronger than ever before, united not just by shared rules but by genuine connection and mutual respect. The transformation had begun, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose for both her and the community at large. In the weeks following the blizzard, Karen made it her mission to amend her relationships with her neighbors. She began by inviting them to a community meeting, not to enforce rules or dictate guidelines, but to listen and learn from their experiences. The atmosphere was noticeably different from those earlier HOA meetings. There was a sense of openness and willingness to engage in dialogue. As she stood in front of her neighbors, Karen felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I realize now that I've made mistakes in my role as an HOA member. Instead of fostering a sense of community, I enforced rules that alienated many of you. I'd like to apologize for that. The room was silent for a moment, and Karen sensed the weight of their collective histories hanging in the air. Then Richard spoke up, "We appreciate you saying that, Karen. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." Encouraged by his response, she continued, "I want to hear your thoughts on how we can work together moving forward. I believe we can create a more inclusive environment where everyone's needs are valued." With that, a lively conversation ensued. Neighbors shared their experiences during the blizzard, discussed their differing perspectives on snow removal, and brainstormed ideas for creating a more supportive community culture. What once had been a room filled with tension transformed into one where laughter, ideas, and solutions flowed freely. As the meeting progressed, Karen realized that many of her neighbors had great insights about balancing aesthetics with practicality. They discussed establishing clearer guidelines for community services like snowplowing, ones that would take into account the varying needs of families and individuals living there. By the end of the evening, Karen found herself advocating for changes that would reflect the collective voice of the community rather than her own rigid beliefs. "Let's draft a proposal for fairer HOA rules that prioritize both beauty and safety," she suggested, sparking renewed enthusiasm among her neighbors. With newfound trust rebuilding among them, Karen felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just as an enforcer of rules but as a genuine member of a community where cooperation was paramount. She vowed to continue fostering these connections beyond meetings and into daily life. As spring approached, Karen noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamics. Neighbors were more inclined to help one another, whether it was sharing gardening tips or lending tools. The foundation laid during those conversations grew stronger each day. Through her journey from isolation to inclusion, Karen learned that true leadership thrived on empathy and understanding. With her commitment to listening and supporting her neighbors' diverse needs, she had transformed not only her own perspective but helped cultivate a neighborhood united by respect and collaboration, a place where everyone could thrive together.